Number 1. The Cerutti Mastodon Site. In 1992, a highway crew was cutting a path for State Route 54 through San Diego County, California. The machines exposed a bed of broken bones. Paleontologist Richard Cerutti was called in, and the site took his name. What his team pulled from the ground would eventually challenge the single, most basic date in American archaeology. The bones belonged to a mastodon, an elephant relative of the Ice Age. That alone was not strange. What was strange was the state of the bones. Several were snapped in a spiral pattern, the kind of break that happens only when a bone is fresh, not when it has already turned to stone. Beside them sat 5 heavy stones. 2 looked like hammerstones. Others looked like anvils. Some carried impact scars that matched the damage on the bone. Thomas Desmarais of the San Diego Natural History Museum led the excavation. In 2017, he and a team including Stephen Holen, Richard Fulligar, and James Paces published their conclusion in the journal Nature. Using uranium series dating on the bone, the United States Geological Survey returned an age of about 130,700 years. Sit with that number. The mainstream consensus puts the first humans in the Americas somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. The Cerutti claim pushes a human presence back more than 100,000 years earlier. If it is right, everything written about how and when people reached this continent is wrong. The problems came fast. No human bones were found. No worked stone tools. No shaped blades. Only the alleged hammers and anvils. The archaeologist Gary Haynes argued the fractures could have come from the construction equipment that found them, or from ordinary geological pressure. Heavy machines had, after all, been running right through the deposit. There is also the question of who. 130,000 years ago, our own species had not clearly left Africa for the Americas. So the candidates become stranger. Neanderthals, Denisovans, even Homo erectus. To support their case, the team smashed modern elephant bone with stone hammers and reproduced the same spiral breaks. No second site has confirmed a human presence that old anywhere in the Americas. The specimens sit today in the San Diego Natural History Museum. The claim remains one of the most fiercely contested in the field, and it sets our question for everything that follows. If a date this fundamental can be dragged 100,000 years, what else that feels settled is standing on sand? Number 2. Easter Island's Collapse Myth. Rapa Nui sits about 3,700 kilometers off the coast of Chile. It is one of the loneliest inhabited places on Earth. Around 900 stone giants, the Moai, were carved there from volcanic rock at the Rano Raraku quarry. For decades, the island served as a grim little parable. The story goes like this. A thriving people, maybe 15,000 strong, cut down every last tree to move their statues. With the forest gone, the soil failed, society fell into war and starvation, and the population crashed to a fraction of its peak, all before any European arrived. The geographer Jared Diamond made this ecocide the centerpiece of his 2005 book, Collapse. It became one of the most repeated cautionary tales in modern history. Then, archaeologists started checking it. Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo, in their book The Statues That Walked, pointed out that much of the deforestation was driven by the Polynesian rat, which ate the palm seeds and stopped the forest from regrowing. The islanders were not simply hacking their world to death. The strongest blow came in 2024. A study in Science Advances, using ancient DNA from 15 former inhabitants, found no genetic trace of a population crash before European contact. The genomes told a story of slow, steady growth. The same study found Native American ancestry in the Rapa Nui already present before Europeans arrived, hinting at trans-Pacific contact centuries earlier than assumed. So when did the real collapse happen? After the outsiders came. The Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen landed on Easter Sunday, 1722. Then came Peruvian slave raids in 1862 and 1863, and diseases like smallpox. By 1877, the population had fallen to about 110 people. The islanders, far from being reckless, had engineered their survival. They built rock gardens, covering fields with broken stone to shelter crops and enrich the soil. Oral tradition said the Moai walked to their platforms, and experiments show the statues could indeed be rocked upright along a path by teams with ropes. The revised picture flips the moral entirely. This was not a people who destroyed themselves. This was a people whose decline was inflicted from outside. The famous morality tale, it turns out, outlived the evidence that once supported it. And if a story this well known can be inverted, then a monument even more famous deserves a second look. Number 3. The Sphinx water erosion hypothesis. The Great Sphinx of Giza is usually credited to the pharaoh Khafra, around 2500 BC, in the 4th dynasty. It stretches about 73 meters long and stands about 20 meters high, carved from a single outcrop of limestone bedrock. That date appears in nearly every textbook. A geologist decided to read the stone instead of the books. In the early 1990s, Robert Schoch of Boston University examined the deep grooves cut into the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. The independent researcher John Anthony West had first pointed them out. Schoch argued the pattern, vertical, rounded, and undulating, is what prolonged rainfall runoff carves, not what wind and blowing sand produce. Here is the catch. Egypt turned into a hyper-arid desert after about 3000 BC. Heavy, sustained rain requires a much earlier, wetter climate. Schoch concluded the core body of the Sphinx was carved somewhere between about 7000 and 5000 BC. That is thousands of years before Khafra was born. Egyptologists pushed back hard. Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass defended the 4th dynasty date. Their counter-argument is that the weathering comes from wind, salt crystallization, and the poor quality of the soft limestone layer the Sphinx is cut from. The geologist James Harrell suggested that wet sand, rather than falling rain, could produce a similar look. There are other loose threads. The head of the Sphinx is strikingly small for its body, which some read as a sign that an older, more eroded head was recarved. The dream stele of Thutmose IV, from around 1400 BC, records clearing sand from the monument, but never names its builder. In fact, no Old Kingdom text directly names Khafra as the creator. The debate went public at the 1992 meeting of the Geological Society of America, where Schoch presented beside his critics. A seismic survey by Thomas Dobecki suggested the rock beneath the enclosure had weathered to depths consistent with an older age, though that too is disputed. The pattern here is telling. Geologists tend to favor the older date. Archaeologists defend the traditional one. Both are staring at the same stone and reading two different histories. Even if Schoch is only partly right, the certainty around one of the most iconic dates in the world takes a real dent, and dates are not the only thing in dispute. So is the very birth of writing. Number 4. The Tărtăria Tablets. In 1961, the archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa was digging at Tărtăria in Alba County, Romania. He found 3 small clay tablets. 2 were covered in rows of incised symbols. 1 was pierced with a hole. They belonged to the Vinca culture of southeastern Europe, and they raised a heretical question. Did writing really begin in Sumer? The standard story says yes. Writing was invented in Mesopotamia around 3200 BC in the form of cuneiform and spread out from there. But the symbols on the Tărtăria tablets, part of what scholars call the Old European or Danube script, sit in a layer with contested dates as early as about 5300 BC. If those symbols are true writing, they could predate cuneiform by as much as 2,000 years. The context was dramatic. The tablets lay near the treated bones of an adult, along with figurines and a bracelet. There is a complication, though. The tablets were baked after their discovery to harden them, which muddies any direct scientific dating. The archaeologist Maria Gimbutas seized on the find as evidence of a literate Old Europe. Skeptics were not convinced. They argued the marks are religious symbols, or marks of ownership, not a system that records a spoken language. The wider Vinca sign collection includes hundreds of distinct symbols found on thousands of objects across the Balkans, but there is no Rosetta Stone for it. It remains undeciphered. The core of the dispute is a deep question. Where do symbols end and writing begin? A tally? A sacred mark? A maker's stamp? None of these are the same as a script that captures the sounds of speech. Critics say the Danube signs lack the structure you would expect from real writing. Defenders say, we simply cannot read them yet. The disturbed layers at the site fuel the doubt. The tablets now rest in the National Museum of Transylvanian History in Cluj-Napoca. Whatever the final verdict, the find makes one thing clear. Southeastern Europe in the Neolithic was more sophisticated than the old model allowed, and the tidy tale of writing being invented once, in one place, looks shakier than it used to. Ideas, it seems, traveled early. And so, remarkably, did entire monuments. Number 5. Mawn and Stonehenge's Welsh origin. Stonehenge rises from Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, built in stages from around 3000 BC to 2000 BC. Its outer sarsens are local, but its smaller inner stones, the blue stones, are not. They come from the Preseli Hills of Pembrokeshire in West Wales, about 225 kilometers, roughly 140 miles away. The geologist Herbert Henry Thomas traced the bluestones to Wales back in 1923. For a century, the obvious question hung in the air. Why on earth would anyone drag stones 140 miles across Britain? A team led by Mike Parker Pearson of University College London went looking for the answer at the source. They excavated ancient quarries at Carngodog and Craigrose, Phelan in the Preseli Hills. Then, in 2021, they published findings on a nearby site called Mawn, the remains of a dismantled stone circle. The numbers were startling. Mawn had an original diameter of about 110 meters. That matches the diameter of the ditch that encloses Stonehenge almost exactly. There was more. Both monuments are aligned on the midsummer solstice sunrise, and one empty stone socket at Mawn had an unusual cross-section, a distinctive shape, that matches one particular bluestone standing at Stonehenge today. The implication is extraordinary. Mawn may have been taken apart, and its stones carried east to help build Stonehenge around 3000 BC. If so, Stonehenge is, in part, a second-hand monument, a Welsh circle reassembled on an English plain. It would explain the long-distance transport that has puzzled people for generations. The stones were not just rock. They may have carried the identity of a migrating people who brought their sacred place with them when they moved. Dating at Mawn using radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence pointed to use around 3400 to 3000 BC. The circle may once have held 30 stones or more. Critics are cautious. They note the direct link is circumstantial, and later work suggested that not every Stonehenge bluestone came from Mawn, so it was likely one source among several. Still, the idea reframes Britain's most famous monument. It did not simply begin where it now stands. It may be the product of long-distance human movement, an assembly rather than a single act of creation. Monuments moved, but the sea can hide something even larger. It can hide an entire country. Number 6. Doggerland. Beneath the gray water of the southern North Sea lies a lost land. It once joined Britain to continental Europe, a bridge of solid ground where ferries now cross. It is called Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, which itself is named for old Dutch fishing boats called doggers. The archaeologist Bryony Coles gave the drowned country its name in 1998. During the last ice age, so much water was locked in ice that sea levels sat up to 120 meters lower than today. That exposed a vast plain of rivers, marshes, and lakes. It was not a barren land bridge. It was a rich home for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, some of the finest hunting and fishing grounds in all of Europe. We know people lived there because the sea keeps giving up their world. Fishing trawlers have hauled mammoth tusks, bison bones, and antler tools from the seabed, even a fragment of a Neanderthal skull. In 1931, a boat working the Lehman and Ower banks brought up a barbed antler harpoon point dated to around 11,000 BC. A team at the University of Bradford, led by Vincent Gaffney, did something clever. They took seismic survey data gathered by oil companies and used it to map Doggerland's buried rivers and hills, drawing the outline of a country no living person has ever seen. The land was slowly swallowed as the seas rose between about 8,000 and 6,000 BC. Then came a sudden blow. Around 6,200 BC, an enormous underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, called the Storegga Slide, sent a tsunami sweeping across the North Sea. Sediment cores show a telltale tsunami deposit layer along the coasts. For any communities still clinging to the low ground, it may have been the end. The consequences reach into our sense of geography itself. Britain was not always an island. It was a peninsula of Europe until only about 8,000 years ago. An entire inhabited chapter of European prehistory now lies underwater, largely unexcavated, studied by divers and by geophysical prospecting. The area called the Brown Bank, between England and the Netherlands, still yields worked flints and human remains. People sometimes call it Britain's Atlantis, but there is nothing mythical about it. Doggerland is real, mapped, and documented, a reminder that the familiar shape of the continents is a recent accident. The sea buried one world. A forest, it turns out, buried another. Number 7. The Acre Geoglyphs and Amazonian Terra Preta. For a long time, the Amazon rainforest was cast as a pristine wilderness, a green desert with soil too poor to feed any large society. The people who lived there were imagined as small, scattered bands. Then, the trees started coming down, and the ground told a different story. Since the 1970s, deforestation in the Brazilian state of Acre has exposed hundreds of geometric earthworks called geoglyphs. They are enormous ditched enclosures, squares, circles, and hexagons, often 100 to 300 meters across. Researchers Denise Shawn and Marty Perssonen documented and dated them, placing most of their construction between about 2,000 and 650 years ago. These were not clearings hacked from virgin forest. The evidence suggests the builders managed the woodland around them, a form of agroforestry, and then there is the soil itself. Across the Amazon basin lies Terra Preta, Portuguese for black earth, a dark, astonishingly fertile soil that people made on purpose. It is packed with charcoal, or biochar, along with pottery fragments and organic waste. Some Terra Preta deposits are more than 2,000 years old and remain fertile to this day, which is why modern scientists study them as a model for locking carbon into the ground. The soil scientist Wim Sombroek helped bring this black earth to wider scientific attention. It is in effect an ancient technology hiding in the dirt. The settlements were real too. In the Upper Jingu region, the anthropologist Michael Heckenberger studied a complex called Kuhikugu and found grid-like, planned towns connected by wide causeways with plazas and roads. LiDAR and remote sensing have since revealed still more earthworks hidden beneath intact canopy. Put it together, and the numbers are staggering. A 2018 study estimated the pre-Columbian Amazon may have held 8 to 10 million people. The reason the forest looks so untouched is grim. After European contact, disease swept through, and the population collapsed, and the trees grew back over abandoned towns and fields. An earlier generation of scholars, led by Betty Meggers, had insisted the Amazon's poor soils could never support dense populations. That view is now largely overturned. Domesticated and semi-domesticated tree species still cluster near ancient settlement sites. the fingerprints of people who shaped this forest for thousands of years. The Amazon was not empty. It was one of the great engineered landscapes on Earth. People shaped the land. Next, they turned the sea into a highway. Number 8. The Uluburun Shipwreck. In 1982, a sponge diver named Mehmed Shakir was working off a rocky point called Uluburun near Kaş on the southern coast of Turkey. On the seabed, he saw what he described as metal biscuits with ears. They were oxhide-shaped copper ingots, and they belonged to a ship that had sunk around 1320 BC in the Late Bronze Age. From 1984 to 1994, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, led by George Bass and Simal Pulak, excavated the wreck through thousands of dives on a steep slope between about 44 and 61 meters deep. What they brought up was a snapshot of a connected ancient world. The ship carried about 10 tons of Cypriot copper in 354 ingots. It also held about 1 ton of tin. Combine copper and tin in the right proportion and you get bronze, and the ratio in the hold was almost exactly right. This was, in a sense, the raw material of an age loaded onto one vessel. The rest of the cargo reads like a map of the known world. Canaanite jars, some holding terebinth resin used as incense. Raw glass ingots in cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender, among the earliest known. African blackwood from Egypt, hippo and elephant ivory, and ostrich eggshells. And Baltic amber beads, which means the trade lines reached all the way to northern Europe. The most surprising twist came in 2022. A study of the tin's isotopes and trace elements traced some of it to sources in Central Asia, in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. That means overland routes thousands of kilometers long were feeding metal into the Mediterranean economy. The world of 1300 BC was far more interconnected than the image of isolated, self-sufficient kingdoms suggests. The cargo drew on at least 7 cultures: Mycenaean, Cypriot, Egyptian, Canaanite, Kassite, Nubian, and Baltic. Among the finds was a gold scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. Personal items hint that Mycenaean Greeks were aboard. There were tools, weapons, weights, and even a wooden writing board. The value of it all points to a royal-level shipment, palace-to-palace exchange, rather than casual trade. Uluburun is one of the oldest and richest shipwrecks ever excavated, and it quietly overturns the idea of a fragmented ancient world. This was an early form of globalization. Connection was the rule. But complexity, it turns out, does not always arrive with the tools we expect. Number 9. Caral-Supe. There is a checklist people carry in their heads for what makes a civilization: writing, pottery, armies, and warfare. A city in the deserts of Peru fails almost every item on that list, and yet it is unmistakably a civilization, and one of the oldest anywhere. Caral sits in the Supe Valley, about 200 kilometers north of Lima, and roughly 23 kilometers inland. It is the largest site of the Caral-Supe culture, also called Norte Chico, the oldest known civilization in the Americas. The Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady began excavating there in 1996. Radiocarbon dating placed its main construction around 2600 BC, which makes it a contemporary of the Egyptian pyramids. The site spreads across about 60 hectares and holds 6 large platform mounds. The greatest, the Pyramid Mayor, measures roughly 160 meters long, 150 meters wide, and 18 meters high. In front of the mounds lie 2 sunken circular plazas, gathering places for public ceremony. Now, the absences. Archaeologists have found no city walls, no weapons, and no mutilated war casualties at Caral. There is no pottery either. The society was pre-ceramic. Instead of writing, the people may have kept records with knotted cords called quipu, and a possible early example was found at the site. So, how did it work? The economy ran on cotton and fish. Farmers inland grew cotton, which was traded to coastal communities for nets, and the fishers sent back anchovies and sardines. It was an exchange network built on textiles rather than clay pots. and they had music. 32 flutes made from the bones of condors and pelicans were discovered there. This overturns a comfortable assumption that early states were forged in warfare, that the pressure of conflict is what builds complex society. Caral had monumental architecture, planned public spaces, and long-distance trade, with no sign of war at all. It predates the Olmec of Mesoamerica by about 1,000 years, and it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2009. Scholars describe it as a mother city that shaped later Andean cultures. Its key technology was cloth, not ceramics, an entirely different road to civilization than the one the textbooks describe. Caral pushes the origins of Andean society back by centuries, and it stands as direct proof that the standard checklist for civilization is not a law of nature. The checklist broke. Now, watch a single technology rewrite the size of an entire people. Number 10. The Maya LiDAR Revolution. The last reversal is not a sight at all. It is a tool. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, fires laser pulses from an aircraft toward the ground. Most pulses hit the treetops, but some slip through the gaps to the forest floor, and by measuring them all, you can strip away the jungle and map the bare earth beneath. Pointed at the Maya lowlands, it rewrote a civilization. In 2018, the Pacunum LiDAR Initiative surveyed more than 2,100 square kilometers of the Petén region in northern Guatemala. The team included Marcello Canuto of Tulane University and Francisco Estrada Belli. When the data was cleaned and the canopy removed, more than 60,000 previously unknown structures appeared. There were houses, palaces, raised roads, farming terraces, defensive walls, and fortifications, all hidden under dense rainforest. The scale forced a dramatic revision. The old model imagined the Maya lowlands as thinly populated, dotted with vacant ceremonial centers that were mostly empty except during festivals. The LiDAR data suggested a population of 7 to 11 million people at the late Classic peak, around 650 to 800 CE. The landscape was engineered on a massive scale. There were raised agricultural fields and irrigation canals for intensive food production. Long elevated causeways, called Sac-Biob, connected cities across many kilometers. Earthworks and moats revealed that warfare was more widespread and organized than anyone had thought. The results were published in the journal Science in 2018. The great site of El Mirador turned out to be linked by causeways into a wider network. A 2022 LiDAR study around El Mirador mapped nearly 1,000 settlements, joined by more than 160 kilometers of causeways, described by some as an early superhighway system. What makes this revolution different is the method. LiDAR maps in a few days what would take decades of exhausting ground survey through jungle. It kills the vacant center model and replaces it with a dense, interconnected, deeply organized Maya world, with terraced hillsides and sophisticated political and economic structures spanning many city-states. The same technology has since been turned on Angkor in Cambodia and on the Amazon, with similar shocks each time. This was not a lucky new dig. It was a new pair of eyes that forced a wholesale rewrite of how many people lived, how they farmed, and how they fought. 10 reversals now sit in front of us. The real question is, what connects them? Step back from the 10 stories, and a pattern comes into focus. Again and again, the same mistakes and the same forces are at work. The most common error is simple. Absence of evidence gets treated as evidence of absence. Because no one had found dense Amazon settlements, the forest was declared empty. Because no early city in Peru had pottery, complexity was assumed to be absent. The gap in the record became a fact about the past. New dating methods keep dragging supposedly settled dates around. The Sphinx, the Danube script, the peopling of the Americas, all shift when a fresh technique is applied. Preservation bias hides whole landscapes. The sea swallowed Doggerland. The jungle buried the Maya cities and the Amazon towns. Soil itself concealed the story of Terra Preta. Popular narratives are their own trap. A vivid tale, like the self-destruction of Easter Island, hardens into common knowledge and then resists correction long after the data has moved. Many early interpretations were shaped by the assumptions of the colonial era, which underestimated the peoples being studied. And that stubborn checklist for civilization, writing, pottery, warfare, keeps failing when reality refuses to match it. There are gentler threads too. Monuments and peoples were far more mobile than assumed, carried across Britain or the Pacific. Trade networks were wider and older than believed. Modern tools, LiDAR, isotope analysis, ancient DNA drive most of the recent revisions. Disease-driven collapse erased the demographic evidence in the Americas, making full continents look emptier than they ever were. Even our recognized anchors still surprise us. And notice that fringe thinkers and mainstream scientists sometimes drift toward the same conclusion, that a thing is older than we thought. The lesson is not that historians are careless. It is that consensus is a snapshot, not a final verdict. The map of the past is drawn in pencil, and revision is the normal state of the science, not a failure of it. To understand why the revisions keep coming, look at the instruments themselves. Almost every reversal in this video rides on a tool that did not exist a lifetime ago. Radiocarbon dating, developed by Willard Libby in 1949, gave archaeology its first reliable clock, and its later calibration made that clock far sharper. For material too old for radiocarbon, uranium series dating steps in, which is exactly what produced the startling Cerutti Mastodon age. Buried sediment can now be dated directly. Optically stimulated luminescence measures when grains of sand last saw daylight, which helped pin down the age of the Welsh circle at Waun. From the air, LiDAR maps ground through the thickest canopy. Beneath the sea, marine seismic survey, first built to hunt for oil, was repurposed to draw the rivers of a drowned country. Then there is the paleogenomics revolution. Ancient DNA can now be pulled from centuries-old bone, which is how researchers overturned the Easter Island collapse and detected trans-Pacific contact. Isotope and trace element analysis fingerprints the origin of metals, which is how the tin on the Uluburun ship was traced across Asia. Satellites and drones add still more coverage. None of these tools is magic. Each carries error bars and assumptions. Calibration curves can shift a published date. Taphonomy, the study of what happens to remains after death, is the delicate art of telling a human cut mark from a natural crack, and it sits at the heart of the Cerutti dispute. A single site with a bold claim faces a reproducibility problem because science trusts patterns that repeat. This is why peer review sometimes lags behind discovery, and why a startling result can take years to settle. Think of it as upgrading from a blurry lens to a sharp one. The object was always there. We simply could not see it clearly. The discipline has its own learning curve, and each new tool both reveals and constrains what we are able to conclude. The next great revision is very likely sitting in a laboratory right now, which leaves an honest and uncomfortable question. What do we still not know? For all the confidence of a finished textbook, the live edges of this field are ragged with open questions. Who, if anyone, actually butchered the Cerutti Mastodon? And could it really have been a human hand 130,000 years ago? When did people truly first set foot in the Americas? The answers are still being argued. Is the Danube script genuine writing, or a system of symbols that never recorded speech? How old is the Sphinx, really? And can geology and archaeology ever be reconciled on it? How many of Stonehenge's bluestones came from Wales, and how many from somewhere else? Each question has serious scholars on both sides. The numbers stay slippery too. How large was Doggerland's population before the waters closed over it? How many people did the Amazon truly hold at its height? Where did every ingot of the Uluburun tin originate? Why did Caral thrive with no pottery and no war, when almost every other early state had both? How complete, even now, is the Maya picture that LiDAR has revealed? Beyond the 10 stories, whole categories remain unsolved. Undeciphered scripts sit in museums around the world. Countless sites lie buried under jungle and sea, untouched. The chronology of the late Bronze Age collapse is still debated. Ancient DNA degrades, so there are places its light will never reach. Proposed links between distant cultures remain contested, and the exact role of climate in each transformation is still being teased apart. There is no shame in this. It is the texture of real inquiry. Some claims stay unresolved for decades, precisely because the evidence is hard and the stakes are high. The honest answer, the one a good historian will give you, is that a great deal remains open. And that raises the last question worth asking. If so much is unsettled, why should any of it matter to us now? These are not just puzzles for specialists. The reversals reach directly into the present. Terra Preta, the engineered black earth of the Amazon, is now studied as a model for soils that lock carbon away, a possible tool against climate change drawn from ancient hands. Ancient water systems and building methods keep informing modern engineers who face the same problems of heat and drought. The rethinking of Easter Island has reshaped how we talk about environmental collapse, warning us against neat morality tales that blame a people for a catastrophe inflicted from outside. Doggerland has become a case study in how fast-rising seas can erase inhabited land, an uncomfortable mirror for coastal cities today. The story of Amazonian land management is now part of real debates over conservation and indigenous stewardship. Time and again, new science has validated indigenous knowledge that earlier scholars dismissed, from the walking of the Moai to the deliberate shaping of the forest. The reversals also carry a warning about just-so stories, the tidy explanations that feel satisfying and turn out to be wrong. Museums are quietly rewriting their labels. Textbooks lag years behind the research, and public fascination sometimes rushes ahead into fringe claims. Careful skepticism is what protects good science from both errors, the stale consensus and the wild guess. Handled openly, these revisions actually build public trust, because they show a field willing to admit it was wrong. The scale of ancient trade revealed at Uluburun echoes our own globalized economy. The soaring population estimates for the Maya and the Amazon reshape our very sense of how many humans have lived and built and farmed. There are hard ethical questions woven through it all, about excavating human remains, about repatriation, about who owns the past. And the work continues right now, with digs and surveys underway on every continent. The past is not a closed book on a shelf. It is a moving target, alive with argument, which brings us to the simplest and largest point of all. Every certainty in this video was once considered settled. The date of the Sphinx, the emptiness of the Amazon, the self-destruction of Easter Island, the peopling of the Americas. Each was written down as fact, and each has been shaken. The past keeps changing, not because it is unknowable, but because we keep looking, and because we keep building better ways to look. Hold on to that one idea. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The empty stretch on the map is very often just the part we have not searched yet. Our ancestors were, over and over, more capable, more numerous, and more connected than we assumed. The picture we inherited sold them short. The map of civilization is still being redrawn, and new tools guarantee new surprises. This is why humility is the historian's real method, not a weakness, but the very engine of discovery. There is a strange thrill in not knowing everything, in standing at the edge of the known and feeling how much is still out there in the dark. So carry a little of that skepticism with you. When someone tells you a thing about the ancient world is simply known, remember the Mastodon bones, the drowned country, the black earth, the laser light falling through the canopy. Consensus today is a draft, not a conclusion. What we know is our best current guess, honestly held and ready to be revised. The reversals are not a failure of history. They are history working exactly as it should. The right response to all of it is not embarrassment, but wonder. The story of the ancient world is not a finished monument. It is an open horizon, and the next discovery that changes everything is already on its way.